This is the third video of a 3-part series on how to rebuild a KTM 2-stroke bottom end. If you need help with disassembly and the first half of reassembly, be sure and watch video 1 and 2 of the series. Now that we have the motor flipped around, we're actually going to remove the shift drum locating unit that we had installed previously to check all the gears. We're going to remove that and install the locking lever. And as we go to install this locking lever, we're going to take the bolt and we're going to apply some medium strength thread locker to it. We're going to place this bolt through the washer, through the locking lever, through the collar with the small end towards the locking lever, and we'll have the curved part of the spring lock in to this part of the locking lever. From there, we can go ahead, thread this into the case, and from there, we need to ensure that the straight side of the spring goes behind the retainer here on the case. And once we get that threaded in by hand, we can go ahead and torque that to 7.4 foot-pounds. And as I'm torquing down this locking lever, I want to make sure that it's free and clear of the case. I don't want it to get hung up so I possibly bend or break this bolt. Okay, now that we have that locking lever torqued down, we need to reinstall the shift drum locating unit. What we'll do is we'll actually pull the bolt out, and there are 2 different sizes of tabs on the back side of this unit. They will only fit one way into the shift drum. So what we need to do is pull back on the locking lever and rotate this unit until it falls into place. Okay, now that we have that unit into place, we need to take some medium strength thread locker, apply it to the bolt, and take our 5mm Allen, go ahead and install that bolt. Once we get that tightened down by hand, we need to torque it down to 7.4 foot-pounds. Okay, now that we have the shift drum locating unit in place and torqued, it's time to install the shift shaft. We need to take the shift shaft, make sure we have the washer on it, slide it into the case through the bearing. As we get close, we need to make sure that the washer fits nicely over that bearing. And there's 2 things to watch for now. There's 2 open-ended springs up on top. Those need to fit nicely over this little tab on the crankcase. Also, once we get there, we need to pull back this sliding plate for it to install all the way. Now our shift shaft is installed. Now is also a great time to temporarily install your shift lever and run through all the gears. It may be a little catchy at first because there is no oil in the motor, but it's a great idea to run through the gears. Now that we have the shift shaft in place, it's time to install our intermediate Kickstarter gear. With this gear, before we install it, there are a few things we need to do. We need to make sure we take a little bit of assembly lube and place it on the dowel that it'll be running on. We can also put a little bit of assembly lube on the inner race of this gear. And when we go to install it, we need to make sure this high side of the gear is facing the case. So we'll slide that on, slide on the washer, and then we'll install the circlip. Now we're just about ready to install the Kickstarter assembly, but first we got to assemble it and make sure it's properly timed. In order to time it, we've got to do the following. We've got to locate the hole on the one side of the shaft. On the other side of the gear, in line with that hole, we're going to see a small line on top of those splines. We need to keep those in mind. Next, we can take our second half of the gear and locate the small dot, the small indent on this gear. And when we slide this on, we need to make sure that this dot is in line with the line on top of the spline and that hole. Now that's properly timed. Now from there, we don't want to lose this timing. So I'm going to keep my fingers here. I'm next going to install the plastic plate. And keep in mind that we need to line the hole in the plastic plate with the hole in the shaft. We'll slide that on. We can then install our spring and press the end of the spring into the hole. Now once we have the plastic plate and the spring installed, we can then install that secondary spring and the small washer. Now as we go to install the Kickstarter assembly, I like to take a little bit of assembly lube, apply a little bit to the surface and inner diameter, and then we're ready to install the Kickstarter assembly. So making sure that we keep this compressed and timed, We want to slowly put this into place and make sure that we keep that small washer on the shaft before we get it installed. Now that we have the Kickstarter assembly inside the case, I like to take the spring holder and the small bolt that goes with it, apply a little bit of medium strength thread locker, and now we can tension the spring. So I'll put the bolt in the spring holder. I'm going to interlock the spring into the spring holder and rotate the spring clockwise. From there, I like to snug down the bolt and make sure it's sitting in its groove and not sitting on that gasket mating surface. From there, we can torque it to 7.4 foot-pounds. Okay, now once we have the Kickstarter assembly in place, it's time to install the primary gear. But before we do that, there's a few things we need to do. We need to take the collar that goes behind that. I like to install a little bit of grease on the inside and outside of the collar. I also take a little bit and grease up the seal. And from there, I can slide this collar onto the end of the crankshaft and into the seal. When installing this collar, it is a pretty tight fit. So it may be required to grab a socket, a large socket that'll fit over the end of the crankshaft and slightly tap it into place. We need to ensure that it goes in evenly. Once we have that collar in place, we can take some assembly lube and put a little bit on the inside diameter of this gear and also on that mounting surface of the crankshaft. We can then take our woodruff key, slide that into place, be careful not to drop it, and we should be able to slide the gear right over that. Now that we have that main gear slid onto the end of the crankshaft, it's time to install our lock washer and our nut. We're going to keep these loose as of right now because we're going to tighten them later. And we got to remember that this nut is a backwards thread, so it's going to tighten in a counterclockwise manner. So we'll just loosely hand thread that on. Now we need to start installing the clutch. So what we're going to do is we're going to install the clutch spacer first. We're going to apply a little bit of assembly lube to both inner and outer surfaces. We're going to slide this onto the main shaft output. And next we'll take the needle bearing, apply a little bit of assembly lube to this, and then we'll install that over the collar. Now that we have the needle bearing into place, take a little bit of assembly lube, lube up the inside diameter of this clutch basket, and then we can slide this on over the needle bearing, and we need to make sure it interlocks with two gears. We need to make sure it interlocks with this intermediate Kickstarter gear and the main shaft gear. So we may need to move it around. Now we have it in place. Next, we can install a washer. Now that we have that washer installed, we need to install the inner clutch hub. So on this bike, we actually have a recluse clutch, and so we are needing to pre-assemble the inner clutch hub before we install it. So we'll go ahead and do that now. Now, starting with this inner clutch hub, we need to install the rubber dampers into their slots. Now that we have those rubber dampers in our inner clutch hub, we can install the centerpiece. It should slide just right into place. Now that we have this recluse inner clutch hub assembled, we can install it into our clutch basket. We can now take the retaining lock washer, install it. There is this lower tab that will fit into the groove. Install some low strength thread locker onto the threads of the nut, and then we can thread this on to that main shaft. Okay, once we have that nut hand tightened, we can take our clutch holding tool, install that, and then taking a torque wrench, we can tighten this nut to 88.5 foot-pounds. So now that we have that nut tightened down on the clutch hub, it's time for us to tighten down the nut on that main gear. So we're going to remove that nut that we had left loose earlier, apply some thread locker to that nut. We're going to install it back onto the crankshaft. Okay, now that we have that main gear nut threaded on by hand, we're actually going to take the Motion Pro gear jammer, throw it into place, and that'll hold our gear into place while we tighten this nut. Okay, and when we go to tighten this nut, again, very important, this is a backwards thread nut. Turning it counterclockwise will tighten this nut. And we need to tighten to 110.6 foot-pounds, so it's going to receive a lot of torque. And we're good to go. Now with the main gear nut tight and the inner clutch hub nut tight, there are the two tabs on that retaining washer on the clutch hub that we need to bend up and lock that nut into place. Now with those locking tabs in place, we're ready to install the rest of our clutch. So we'll take our center pressure rod, slide it through that main shaft, and then we'll start to install all the plates. Now this is a recluse clutch, so the procedures are going to be a little bit different than if you had an OEM clutch. So if you do have an OEM clutch, be sure and check out your service manual for all proper procedures and torque specs. But with the recluse clutch, we're going to install our dowels into the inner clutch hub. Now once we have those dowels in place, it's time to start installing the plates. We're going to start with a steel plate. And again, with this recluse, they have their proprietary steel plates. Now we'll move on to our oiled clutch plates. Again, alternating back and forth between the steels and the friction plates. Now once we've got the last of our steel plates installed, again for this bike on the recluse, we're going to install the EXP clutch disc. Once we've installed the EXP disc, we're going to install their steel plate onto their aluminum cover. And slide that on. We have another small steel ring that fits around the outside. We have the clutch spring itself and the clutch spring retaining plate. And then to install that, we have some Torx bolts. We'll hand thread those in. And now when we go to torque these, we want to torque them in a crisscross pattern, and we want to torque them to 4.4 foot-pounds. Now that everything's tightened on our crankcase, we're ready to install the inner clutch cover. So before we do that, there's a few items of business we need to take care of. We need to make sure that the mating surface, the gasket surface, is nice and clean. Once it's cleaned, I like to take a little bit of grease and grease up the entire sealing surface. This will help the gasket stick to it, seal a little better, and it'll come off a lot nicer when you take it apart again. Once I have the crankcase gasket surface all greased up, I'm going to take the inner clutch cover and do the same thing to it. I'm just about ready to install this inner clutch cover, and I need to make sure I have all the dowels. I've got the 3 dowel pins in the inner clutch cover, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this gasket and place it over the inner clutch cover. As I put this inner clutch cover onto this crankcase, I just need to make sure that everything's aligning properly. The water pump and power valve gear right here, this shaft does need to fit into a small little bearing on this crankcase, so I need to make sure everything's lined up before I completely tighten it down. Now that I've pressed this inner clutch cover into place by hand, I'm actually going to start installing all the bolts, and I'm going to tighten them by hand. Once I have them tightened by hand, I'm going to torque them in a crisscross fashion just to make sure there's no uneven pressure on this inner clutch cover. Once these are all snugged down by hand, I'll go ahead and torque all of them to 7.4 foot-pounds. Again, making sure I do it in kind of a crisscross fashion just to make sure there's no uneven pressure. Now that we have the inner clutch cover torqued down, it's time to install the outer clutch cover. Today we're going to be installing a carbon up armor clutch cover. The procedure is the same as OEM, so we'll just follow that procedure. Go ahead and install it, then install the bolts. And now we'll go ahead and torque them down in a crisscross pattern to 7.4 foot-pounds. Now it's time to install the reed valves and the carburetor boot. So to do that, we're going to take our reed valve body, put the gasket on it. We'll then slide it into our case. From there, we'll take our carburetor boot, making sure that the boot is aligned properly. And we'll go ahead and install the bolts. I'm going to hand tighten these at first, and then we'll torque them down to 7.4 foot-pounds. Now we're ready to install the bottom end back into the bike. When we get it into place, we're going to then install the 2 lower engine mounting bolts, and we're going to slide the swing arm bolt out and put it through the motor. Again, this may be heavy, so make sure you grab a buddy if needed. Now that we have the lower 2 engine mounting bolts and the swing arm bolt in, we're going to go ahead and thread in the swing arm nut and hand tighten these into place, and then we'll torque them afterwards. Now we're ready to go ahead and torque these down. We're going to torque these lower two engine mounting bolts to 44.3 foot-pounds, and then we'll tighten the swing arm nut to 73.8 foot-pounds. Now to finish up the bottom end, we're going to install the front sprocket, Kickstarter, brake pedal, shifter, and then we'll install the slave cylinder for the hydraulic clutch. And that's it for our KTM 2-stroke bottom end rebuild. All we have left to do is throw on the stator and ignition cover, and then throw the top end back on. If you need help with that top end, be sure and check out our video that we have online. And if you have any questions or comments, be sure and comment below. And if you like this content and want to see more videos on how to keep your 2-stroke awesome, be sure and subscribe. I'm Chance with Rocky Mountain. Thanks for watching.